G'day and welcome to Inside Rugby. My name is Mark, and if you haven't been here before, I'm a Kiwi rugby fan that's living here in beautiful Mexico. Now, probably a lot of us are still suffering from a Rugby World Cup hangover so far this year, so I decided to make another video about that. And in this video, I thought I'd talk about the South African rugby fans. G'day everyone and welcome back to my channel. If you haven't been here before, welcome. It's great to have you on board. Hope you stick around, and the best way to do that is to hit the subscribe button and follow the content that I put out about rugby from all across the world. Now, the World Cup is over, of course, and there's been lots of analysis going on from all sorts of different rugby channels talking about all sorts of different things that went on in the Rugby World Cup. And I thought today I'd have a look at one of the things that I really enjoyed throughout this year's Rugby World Cup, and that was the passion of the South African rugby fans. Yes, it was absolutely fantastic to see. And also on this channel where I've built up a large contingent of South African supporters. So hello to you all today. But that's not the real reason I wanted to make it, and I'm certainly not downplaying the rugby fans of other nations. Of course, we have fantastic rugby fans across the world, and whether they come from Ireland, New Zealand, South Africa, Australia, Fiji, it doesn't matter. It's a global rugby community. But there was something very special that I learnt about the South African rugby fans throughout this year's Rugby World Cup, and I'm going to share that in this particular video. Now, the Springboks came into this year's tournament with two very potentially interesting games in their pool stages of the competition. Of course, they were in Pool B, and two games that stuck out in that pool for South Africa were going to be the game against Scotland and the game against Ireland. And there was a lot of anticipation across the rugby world, of course, for both those games before they took place. And I was reading a lot in the South African press and around the rugby world in general, and a lot of people thought that both Scotland and Ireland had a really good chance of upsetting the Springboks in those two games. But now, before that first game against Scotland, there was a lot of online presence by South African supporters talking about how they felt that South Africa were going to be too good in the forwards against Scotland, and also they were going to be able to shut down Finn Russell, and of course he was going to be the key playmaker for Scotland in that game. And that's exactly what happened in the game. It was a case of Finn Russell was absolutely closed out of the game. The South African forwards dominated. The bomb squad came on and did their job, and South Africa ran away with that one 18 points to 3. And even though it was the first game in the Rugby World Cup for the Springboks, I felt as though there was some momentum being gained, and they looked very good against, let's face it, what was prepared to be a very good Scottish team. And they'd had a good warm-up and build-up to this year's 2023 Rugby World Cup. Now, after that game, the Springboks fans got very excited, expecting them to go all the way through the pool stage, and there was a lot of confidence, and quite rightly so, and I shared in that confidence as well after I watched the Springboks display in that first game. Now, the second game for the Springboks fans to get excited about was the game against Romania, although the result was probably never in jeopardy. But there was a lot of talk about, switching of the team and who would actually get a run in this game. So 76 points to 0 against Romania it was, and the Springboks fans kept on a roll with this one, just saying that, well, there we go, we scored all those points. Now we really want to get ourselves ready for that game against Ireland, because that was going to be the big one as far as the Springboks fans considered in the first pool stage. Now, I was reading a few things online with a few Springboks supporters were edging their bets on this one, saying, well, even if we lose to Ireland, we can still win the Rugby World Cup this year. And I have to say, though, there was a minority of people in South Africa saying that. The most were saying that the win against Ireland was in the bag, and it was going to happen, even though everybody thought it was going to be a very close game, and there was a lot of respect shown between the two nations. Now, before that game, a lot of Springboks fans were talking about the Springboks defensive abilities, being able to shut down the Irish backline, and in particular Bundy Archie and Gary Ringrose, and stopping the ball getting to those prominent players who on the Irish side had started off the tournament very well indeed. and they were looking very, very dangerous. But this was going to be a different kind of game for Ireland. They were going to have to go up against the might of the Springboks forwards, and I think a lot of the Springboks fans knew that the Springboks forwards were going to give the Irish pack a bit of a hard time, but it was going to be a very, very close game, and that's what it worked out to be. And in fact, if the Springboks had their kicking boots on that day, it could have been a different result. Would have, could have, should have, but it wasn't, and the Springboks lost that one 13 points to 8. Now, it was interesting reading after that game a lot of the South African fans' comments online talking about the fact that their kicking woes that day didn't help them, but that they would be right going through the rest of the tournament, and the fact that they had lost that game wasn't going to be a problem. So a 13-8 loss to Ireland in that particular game. And next up for South Africa was Tonga, and a lot of South African fans were saying that this game could be a potential banana skin for South Africa. But at the same time, I think everybody agreed that over the course of 80 minutes the Springboks were going to be too strong for Tonga and have too much class across the entire pitch. Reading the comments from the South African fans after that game against Tonga, there was a very good I guess analysis of where South Africa were at this stage of the tournament. They had those tough games against Scotland and Ireland, and they were a bit of battle hardened, if you could say that, in terms of getting ready for their quarter-final game, which was going to be against France. I guess the danger against France that a lot of the South Africans were talking about was the opportunity of their backs scoring spontaneous points, and I think everybody in South Africa was feeling at that time that the South African forward pack was going to make a meal of the French pack in this particular game, and that would starve the French of getting any ball and being able to do too much damage to the South Africans. Now, quite a few comments online from the South African fans before the French game were talking about this is going to be very close. The French are playing very, very well under Fabien Galtier. They've got a really, really good system in place, and of course Antoine Dupont was coming back for this critical game from that fractured cheekbone. So I think there was some nerves there from the South Africans, but at the same time I think they really truly believed that they were going to get over the top of the French, and boy, what a game it was. So as we all know now, that quarter-final game against France was an absolute blockbuster, and South Africa getting home by 1 point, 29 points to 28 in the end. And what a game it was. And if I collectively put all the South African comments together across the internet that I had been reading after that game, it was if you could sum it up in one word, it was relief. There was a huge amount of relief that South Africa got up in that game, and nobody knew what was going to come in the next two games for South Africa. But that was a really, really pivotal point, I thought, in the Rugby World Cup this year, because it really gave South Africa the belief that no matter how far down and out they thought they were in a particular game, they were able to find a way to win. And that's what I started reading a lot from the South African fans after that French game, is that no matter how difficult it gets, this particular Springbok team is going to deliver. So that put South Africa through to a semi-final, and that game of course was against England. It was really interesting reading a lot of the South African press and also the world press about the lead up to that particular game, and I was reading a lot of the South African supporter comments as well. They really thought that this was going to be a potentially tricky encounter for South Africa. The style of game that England were going to bring to this particular game could really upset the South African rhythm, and there was a lot of nerves amongst the South African fans going into that England game. We also saw the weather playing a part as well. We saw the rain starting to come from the quarterfinals onwards in Paris, and that was going to change the conditions that the players had been used to at the beginning of the tournament through the pool stages, where we saw a lot of fine and hot weather, to the extent that we were even having water breaks every 20 minutes. So leading into that semi-final game against England, the nerves were there definitely from the South African supporters, and those nerves continued throughout the game. It was an absolute cliffhanger, and again, by the time the game ended and South Africa had eked out another 1 point win by 16 points to 15, I think that word relief was the key word there for all the South African fans across the world. But again, it just showed that the South African team this year were able to win those games that came down to those crucial split-minute or split-second decisions, and they were able to hang in there with that self-belief that they had. And with New Zealand beating Argentina in their semi-final, was all set up for a massive clash between the New Zealand All Blacks and the Springboks in the final. And as we return to the old foe conversation again, we saw the South African spectators and fans taking on a different tack when it came to their comments online, and that was one of very much being positive that they were going to be able to beat the All Blacks. And I think those wins against France and England gave South Africa that extra bit of self-belief that they were going to get over the line in the final of this particular year's Rugby World Cup. And it was really interesting to see some of the comments leading up to that game from a lot of the South African fans. There was a lot of comments around about how the forwards were going to outplay the New Zealanders, and by having Andre Pollard back in the team, it was going to make a significant difference in that final. Now, it wasn't just the fans online that were really interesting for me from South Africa during this year's Rugby World Cup. It was the momentum that was being gained back in South Africa by the general public and getting behind this team. And as a nation, we started to see across the world how much this Rugby World Cup win would actually create for the South African nation. And that was something really interesting. And as a New Zealander, we all know what it would have meant to New Zealand to win the Rugby World Cup this year. There's no doubt about it. And across all the other nations, there's no doubt that winning the Rugby World Cup would have been absolutely the pinnacle. But when it came to South Africa, there was a different flavour, there was a different ingredient, there was a different taste in your mouth about what this meant for South Africa as a country in this particular time in its history. And very different again to 2019, because this was a team that was trying to go back to back. The country had perhaps gone a little bit backwards since 2019 in some respects, and it needed something. It needed some push of adrenaline, some kind of inspiration and motivation that we can stand together again. And that was really interesting to watch as a neutral in this process, as the South African fans got behind their team leading into that final against New Zealand. And boy, what a final it was. It had everything that we had ever wished for. It had desperation, it had red cards, it had bad discipline, it had bad weather, it had poor handling, it had mistakes, and lots of different things that we'd all spoken about throughout the Rugby World Cup. And in the end, South Africa got across the line 12 points to 11. And of course, the nation erupted into jubilation, and quite rightly so, because they had done something that hadn't been done before. And they'd also done something that was very spectacular from a spectator point of view. And if you look at those last three games, the ones against France, England and New Zealand, all games won by 1 point, all games won in desperate situations. What really summed this Rugby World Cup up for me, for South Africa and all the fans, was this team never knew when they were beaten, and they were never going to give up. And this was the belief that I got through the South African fans, not only on my channel, but across all the rugby YouTube channels and across the rugby press as well. This South African team and their spectators, they didn't want to be beaten, and they weren't beaten in this year's Rugby World Cup in that knockout stage of the tournament. But I'm sitting here today as a New Zealand rugby supporter. I'm sitting here as a global rugby fan, and I'm sitting here in admiration for South Africa and the fans, and the majority of them, and the way that they managed themselves throughout that Rugby World Cup. And they also acknowledged the good standard of rugby from other teams, and they also acknowledged that they could have been beaten. And those games against France and England and New Zealand could have gone either way with another 1 or 2 point swing, that's for sure. But I really enjoyed watching the South African fans throughout this tournament, particularly in the stadiums as well. I listened and watched a lot of the South African ex-rugby player pundits talking about the game and the builds-up and the reviews of the game afterwards as well. And I enjoyed their perspective, and I actually enjoyed their respect that they have for the other great rugby playing nations of the world. And that's something that came out of this Rugby World Cup for me that has been really good. But at the end of the day, the true rugby fans stick together, and we know what it's all about. And that's a respect that we in New Zealand have for South African rugby. And as we probably said, there's probably no other team that we would like to win the Rugby World Cup if we can't win it, is our South African friends, because they really deserved it at the end of the day. So it was a fantastic World Cup from a South African fan's point of view. You had a lot of heart attack moments there, particularly in the knockout stage of the tournament, and you had that little bit of a bump in the road as well against Ireland, and that was a very good game as well. But overall, it was a fantastic World Cup for South African rugby fans. there were some fantastic comments, and I love the depth of knowledge and understanding that South African rugby fans have for the game. I can't wait for 2027. It's going to be absolutely enthralling. And just before I go today, I want to throw this up for my South African friends, because I know it'll get the heart warmed up a little bit and the blood boiling a little bit, because this came out in one of the English papers the other day, and I thought my South African friends might want to see it. So well done again, South Africa, for your win in the 2023 Rugby World Cup. Congratulations to all the fans around the world, and thank you in particular to the South African fans for contributing not only to my channel but to the conversation about world rugby across the world. Without you, we'd miss you tremendously, and rugby would not be the same. So stick around and make sure you're actively involved in making the great game that we all love even better across the world. Come on, 2027, we can't wait. Okay, that's it for this video. Don't forget to stick around and hit the subscribe button and give me some love and support there. And listen, if you're a general sports fan and you love talking about all kinds of different sport, check out my other new YouTube channel where I'm talking about all kinds of different sport other than rugby, and you can find that called Sports World with Mark. I've put a link in the description of this video to find it, so head on over there. Okay, until next time here on Inside Rugby with Mark, I'll be back again soon with some more content. Until then, stay safe, stay well, and it's time to say adios from Mexico.